Our theme for this month is, you are especially acceptable to Jehovah. We love Jehovah, and we want to give him our best. We want our sacrifices to be acceptable to him. So we may strive to be involved as much as possible in all the exciting things going on in the organization. But do you ever feel discouraged? Perhaps even guilty or frustrated regarding your sacrifices to Jehovah? In some cases, it may be that you're so involved in so many different aspects of the work that perhaps you're not giving adequate attention to your spiritual, personal, or family needs. Or on the other hand, it may be the opposite situation. You may have those feelings because you cannot do as much as you'd like to, or as much as others are doing. For example, you may have been very involved in the work, but unexpectedly your circumstances changed because of your health or some other calamity that came along and shut things down. Such feelings may cause us to ask ourselves, what does Jehovah really expect of us? Well, we're going to consider 3 points in our discussion. The first is, we need to set the right priorities. Second, do not compare yourselves unfavorably with others. And third, remember what's important to Jehovah.
I have to ask viewers, why are we revisiting this particular subject so soon? Bear in mind, it was only as recently as the April 2021 broadcast 6 months ago when Samuel Hurd, a governing body member, gave a talk, a JW Broadcasting talk titled, "Is Your Best Good Enough?" An absolutely disgraceful lecture that really ramped up the guilt tripping and reminded Jehovah's Witnesses that they had to put aside mundane activities and make sure that they were spending every waking minute, it seems, doing something that benefits the organization in some way. So we have this talk by Samuel Hurd in April 2021, and only 6 months later, here we are in October 2021, and Robert Luccioni, if you just heard him, is going over pretty much the same ground here. He's talking about our sacrifices, or the sacrifices of Jehovah's Witnesses, and how Jehovah's Witnesses might feel frustrated at not being able to do enough. And he says, such feelings may cause us to ask ourselves, what does Jehovah really expect of us? Well, didn't we just get that material only 6 months ago? Why are we revisiting this? And we're going to be comparing later on in this rebuttal how different this talk is from the material presented by Samuel Hurd. But is this what we've come to with spiritual food? Just revisiting the same topic only 6 months later? Are there no other things that Robert Luccioni could be talking about other than this? It's almost as though Robert Luccioni isn't quite happy with Samuel Hurd's talk from 6 months ago, and he feels he can do better. The problem is when you have two different narratives, and if you're a Jehovah's Witness, you could be saying, well, these aren't different narratives. This isn't different information. It's the same information, just given slightly differently. To which my response would be, why the repetition? But if they are different, if they are significantly different to each other, you then have the question, which one should we take seriously? If you have a governing body member addressing a particular topic one way, and you have a governing body helper addressing the same topic a different way, which one do you listen to? I would argue that you're always going to lean towards what the governing body member has to say, because he is part of the channel. He's supposedly got a direct line with God and is being guided more directly through God's Holy Spirit. And also, if you have two sets of advice, and one set of advice is, shall we say, more challenging to fulfill or more hard-hitting, you're going to err on the side of caution. And I'm going to talk about this a bit more as the broadcast unfolds. But yeah, very interesting that Robert Luccioni should be essentially retreading the same path that Samuel Hurd took us down 6 months ago.
Jehovah expects us to set the right priorities. But how can we do that? Well, a scripture that's helped me is found in 2 Corinthians chapter 8 and verse 12. For if the readiness is there first, it is especially acceptable according to what a person has, not according to what a person does not have. Paul here is discussing sacrifices that are acceptable and sacrifices that are unacceptable to Jehovah. What's the difference? Well, picture it this way. Picture a young family in Corinth, a father, mother, and children. The father hears the letter from Paul being read to the congregation, and the father's very excited. He wants to help his brothers in Judea. Now, when the family gets home, he discusses the matter with his wife. He says, we have a little money that we've set aside to do some work on the house, and we were saving to purchase another donkey. However, I'd like to take that money and contribute it for our needy brothers in Jerusalem. What do you think? Would you say that is an acceptable sacrifice? Yes, it's a sacrifice. He and his family are donating money to help others, but it's according to what the family has. That sacrifice would no doubt be very precious to Jehovah. You can picture how excited the family would be to support that decision.
So hopefully you can see what I mean when I say that this lecture, this JW Broadcasting sermon, isn't as hard-hitting as the one 6 months ago. Robert Luccioni is very much giving this softer narrative that, okay, a lot is expected of Jehovah's Witnesses, but they're only expected to give as much as they have. And he kicks off with this verse in 2 Corinthians 8, verse 12, which is actually quite reasonable. It is especially acceptable according to what a person has, not according to what a person does not have. You don't have to give stuff if you don't have it. If you're needy yourself, then you're not in a position to give. That's basically the message, at least at this point of Robert Luccioni's talk. The problem is, well, think about the analogy. He's talking about a family in Corinth who supposedly have some kind of surplus. They have money they've been setting aside to do work on the house and to buy a new donkey. And based on just this information in this, albeit analogy, Jehovah's Witnesses are being asked to judge whether it would be an acceptable sacrifice. Well, who's to say that the existing donkey isn't really old and on its last legs, so they need a new donkey? And who's to say that the house isn't dilapidated and is about to cave in, so they need to do work on the house? How do you just kind of swoop in and play judge and jury as to what is or isn't urgent or what is or isn't necessary? This is the entire mentality that I would argue Jehovah's Witnesses are encouraged to have, to effectively judge what others are doing and what others are contributing. That's the mentality that Robert Luccioni is appealing to in this analogy. And yes, again, I think he's coming from the right place. You can only give as much as you have. I would just say there's a problem with his analogy in that it makes assumptions. You're assuming that the extra donkey isn't necessary. You're assuming that the work on the house isn't urgently needed. And I think, quite frankly, fundamentalist religious people tend to assume an awful lot. That's one of the problems, I think, with fundamentalist religion, is it's entirely based on just supposing things to be true without having all the facts at your disposal.
But now let's imagine a different family in the same congregation. This time, the husband comes home and says, I know we do not have any extra money, but I'd like to use the money that we've set aside to feed our family for the next 2 weeks and donate it for the brothers that are in need in Jerusalem. What do you think now? Would you say that is an acceptable sacrifice? It's the same good motive, the same good cause. It may even be the same amount of money. But is it acceptable? No. Why? It's not according to what he has. Jehovah does not want him to take food away from his children. Can you imagine him explaining that decision to his family? The father has a God-given responsibility to feed his family. Paul says, just give according to what you have. What's the lesson for us? How can this help us to maintain balance and set the right priorities? Well, our sacrifices are acceptable to Jehovah if we give according to what we have. But our sacrifice would be unacceptable if we try to give beyond what we have.
I hope you noticed Robert Luccioni say something interesting there when he talked about balance.
What's the lesson for us? How can this help us to maintain balance and set the right priorities?
So this talk is apparently all about balance, or applying balance, maintaining balance in the context of how much Jehovah's Witnesses are giving, how much Jehovah's Witnesses are doing. I think it's interesting, again, going back to what I was saying earlier about Samuel Hurd's talk. My knowledge of these broadcasting episodes is that they take about 6 months to put together. It wouldn't surprise me if there was a bit of backlash to Samuel Hurd's talk, which again, and I'm going to show examples later in this rebuttal, was appalling and just layered on the guilt for Jehovah's Witnesses. There was no scenario, if you're a Jehovah's Witness, in which you're not going to feel guilty in some way, according to Samuel Hurd's talk. You're always guessing, aren't you, as a Jehovah's Witness, when you're on the Jehovah's Witness hamster wheel. Am I doing enough? Is this enough? Oh no, I could do a bit more. We saw this as well in the Ramapo video, which incidentally has been taken down. Here's a clip of a couple talking about how they got rid of their dog to go and assist on the Warwick build.
Probably one of the hardest things that we had to do was find a home for our dog. We eventually found her at home with a beautiful family.
Interestingly, this video, as of now, is no longer available to see on the website. I managed to do a rebuttal to it on the channel. Thumbnail is here, if Tibor is gracious. But yeah, that's the level of fanaticism the organization wants. But it wouldn't surprise me if there's a bit of backlash, if there's a bit of pushback to the level of fanaticism. I mean, it wouldn't surprise me if the Ramapo video got pulled because there were witnesses calling in and saying, really? We need to get rid of our dogs now, you know? And with this Robert Luccioni talk, again, 6 months on from Samuel Hurd's talk, it just feels very much like Robert Luccioni is trying to apply correction fluid or Tipex to much of what was in Samuel Hurd's talk. It feels like he's trying to rewrite it. And the problem you have is that, again, if you have two sets of advice with eternal blessings from God on the line, with survival of Armageddon at stake, as a Jehovah's Witness, you're always going to play it safe, and you're always going to follow the most extreme advice, especially if it's coming from a governing body member. But anyway, Robert Luccioni is giving this analogy about donations, this fictional family in Corinth. I think it's a bit of a low-hanging fruit to make this about money, because it's easy, well, theoretically easy, to count how much money someone has and how much money they need and say, oh, there's a surplus here. But it's not easy to do that in terms of people's time, is it? And that's ultimately what Jehovah's Witnesses are expected to give, their time. How do you neatly quantify how much time someone has and how much time someone needs and how much time someone has available? That's a bit too complicated for Robert Luccioni, so he plays it safe and goes with an analogy about money. But again, who's to say how much money is or isn't needed, whether the donkey is needed or not, whether the work on the house is needed or not? It's all just, well, obviously it's a fictional narrative, but it's presupposition. We're asked to suppose certain things about both families. Ultimately, the second part of the analogy is saying, if you're poor, if you don't have enough money for yourself, then you're not expected to give. But what have we heard recently from governing body member Tony Morris?
Jehovah doesn't approve coming empty-handed. See, and what would help us to not come empty-handed, in this case back in Israel or in our time either? Notice verse 17, and this is a lot to think about. The gift that each one brings should be in proportion to the blessing that Jehovah your God has given you. So there we have it. You stop and reflect that they were supposed to do that, and we can do the same throughout the year. Reflect on the blessings that Jehovah God has given us. You got to take time to do that. You have to give that consideration. The gift that each one brings should be in proportion to the blessing. So adding up these blessings, then we're happy to give out of our material possessions. So profound thought there, and something to reflect on so that we don't find ourselves, when it comes to contributions on a monthly basis or whatever, empty-handed. Well, I'm doing so much here and there. Well, money meets a response in all things, and you have to take that into account, even if we're in the poor range.
Even if we're in the poor range, even poor people need to give to the organization. How do we reconcile these two completely different bits of advice? Robert Luccioni, on the one hand, saying, well, if it's a poor family, it would be unreasonable for them to deprive their children of food in order to give for others. And on the other hand, you've got Tony Morris saying it's expected that all Jehovah's Witnesses should give monetarily to the organization, even if they are in the poor range. And yes, I get it. If you're a Jehovah's Witness watching this, you could be saying, yes, but what about the needy widow? Even when you're poor, you can still give something. But I would argue, as someone who I feel knows a little bit about poverty, I'm not poor, but I feel like I've seen it. I went to the Dominican Republic at the age of 23, and I was joining up with some Jehovah's Witnesses who were need graters, and we did some preaching in a slum in the Dominican Republic where the houses didn't have floors. So it was open sewers, and the mud from the street continued on into the house. There was no floor. It was just mud. People living in mud. And there are Jehovah's Witnesses, you can bet, who are that poor, who are living on $1 or less per day. I would argue, if you're poor, you need to keep every penny you can get your hand on to get yourself out of that situation if you can. You shouldn't be thinking about sending money through to the organization, especially when you have individuals like Tony Morris caught going round booze stores on a Sunday morning, splashing their money lavishly on expensive booze. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, thumbnail here if Tibor is gracious. I'm sorry, I understand, again, where Robert Luccioni is coming from. He's trying to soften, I think, Samuel Hurd's talk and say, whoa, we can have balance here. And here's this convenient analogy involving money to show you what balance is all about. I get it. I think it's good. It's a good message. It's just, again, who do we listen to, Robert Luccioni? Do we listen to you, or do we listen to Samuel Hurd and Tony Morris?